Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here with a new video about my top 5 features of Element 3D version 2, as well as my overall thoughts and review of the product. So if you're not familiar with Element 3D, what it is an After Effects plugin that allows you to import 3D models and objects straight into After Effects and allows you to animate, light, and interact with them in the familiar After Effects environment, as well as use the 3D objects in a particle system which allows you to replicate the objects in a variety of ways. Additionally, one of the biggest benefits is that it's built in a smart way to really cut down on render time and speed up renders so you don't ever get bogged down with hours and hours of rendering through lots of little 3D tricks of how it's set up. It's a really useful tool, but it's important to also understand what it is and what it isn't. So it isn't a full 3D modeling program, so you're not going to be doing modeling in it. For that, you need to still be modeling things in programs like Cinema 4D or Maya, or find objects online. And it's not a full standalone 3D application. So there are not things that might be familiar to other 3D apps, such as character animation and rigging and 3D dynamics and gravity and those sorts of things. But if you really understand what it is, what its uses are, and where it sits in the 3D animation visual effects field, it can really help you utilize it in the best ways. How I see it is there's really two camps of people where this product is really useful for. One, you do have a solid understanding of standalone 3D apps such as Cinema 4D or Maya, and you want to have the option of using this if it makes sense for the project when you're at the beginning stages of it, depending on the details such as the needs of the project and deadline, and just keep it as an extra tool to think about. Two, you're pretty comfortable with After Effects, however, you don't have much experience with standalone 3D apps and they can seem intimidating, and you want to utilize After Effects and bring in some 3D parts without as high of a learning curve and really use it as an entry point to working with and understanding 3D. It can be a really great transition into working in 3D to kind of get you off the ground without having to learn a completely new program and do things in ways that seem familiar in After Effects. Where I sit is in Camp 1, where I have a really solid understanding of both Cinema 4D and Element 3D. And depending on the project, I pick the best tool for the job rather than trying to just fit which one I might want to use into that box. So for this video, my thought was rather than just point out a bunch of new features, I wanted to show some real projects that I did using Element 3D over the last year and a half in version 1, and how they could be improved with some of the new features, and how all the new bells and whistles of version 2 really help to push where Element 3D is more towards what you might expect in full 3D apps, as well as how it compares to some things that might be familiar to how you would work in 3D environments. So that's enough of me talking about my thoughts. Let's get to the list and dive into some of these new features. Number 1, a smoother UI. So let's start from the beginning. If we're using Element 3D, what we're going to do is make a new composition, and I'll use these settings, and I'll call this whatever I want, and then I'm going to make a new solid with Command or Control Y, and I'll call this element, and we want to put the effect on here. So you'd go under effects and type in element, or go to Video Copilot tab and drag it onto the solid, and that's where our effect is going to come in. And to get into setting up the 3D objects, we go to Scene Setup, and this basically opens up an entire application on top of After Effects with Element 3D interface. So if you've used version 1 and you start doing things, one thing you'll notice right away is the interface looks a lot updated and there's a lot more buttons and things work a lot better. So right away, if I just go to create, there's all these primitives and I'll grab a cylinder. And now with my objects, there are tools that would be familiar to working in 3D, like move, rotate, and scale. And there's shortcuts to all of these, which are W for move, E for rotate, R for scale. So very quickly, we could rotate, move, scale, and kind of do some quick things to really build some objects. And it works really well to give you more control in this interface over controlling things and really moving, scaling, and adjusting things that are familiar to how 3D apps work. For example, in Cinema 4D, this is what you would expect. We have had the same sort of thing. If we had a cube and you have little controllers to move, rotate, or scale your object. And now we're getting that in Element 3D, along with quick shortcuts, which is great. I'm always looking for the fastest and most efficient way to do things. And there's a lot of shortcuts. If you get things kind of moved out and you can't see, you can press Z to center the camera, as well as F if you want to show shaded or wireframe, and G for the grid. And if you're wondering if you're thinking, where's he getting all this from? This isn't even in documentation. Well, I went with my tried and true method if I'm trying to figure out shortcuts of press every button and see what happens. Except that one because it hid my whole model. Anyway, this really helps, and it's really a more efficient way to do things. We can even copy objects within our groups by holding Option or Alt, dragging up, and very quickly, even though we're not doing full 3D modeling, and we can really organize our parts inside Element 3D without having to try to move them around in After Effects on separate groups and things like that, which could be a little slow and cumbersome before. You'll also notice that the textures and all the information is updated. There's now group folders and group objects that you can do things like press Option, turn on and off, or press Option to turn all the other ones off, as well as the updated preset browser with all of our materials, our new physical materials, our environments, which are heavily expanded, which we'll get into later, and new physical bevels. So there's a lot of UI updates. It's a lot more cleaner and more modern, lots of shortcuts that help us work in 3D and really push it more towards some things we'd expect to have available when organizing objects and models in a 3D environment. Number 2, shadows and reflections. So this is probably the one that people were waiting for the most, and probably one of the biggest updates, because it really pushes things to be more believable 3D and address a lot of the issues that would come up with version 1. So let's take a look at these pipes. We can see that this is in Element 3D and they're sitting on this floor, and we're getting shadows. It looks like we're getting reflections, and the objects are relating to each other. And that's really what makes 3D believable, because 3D is mimicking reality, and how real objects work is when you start hitting them with light, what you see is the materials being reflected back based on their physical properties and interacting with each other by causing things like reflections and shadows. So to point out a real project, here is something I did in version 1.0 about a year and a half ago in version 1 with this 3D logo, and it was fine, but I wasn't happy with it. You can see the helmets look like they're kind of floating, and we're not getting shadows and things like that. And I ended up redoing it in Cinema 4D to get the result I wanted, where there's shadows on the floor, and we're seeing real shadows happening here based on the letters and more realistic setup. Like we can see in Cinema 4D, we're getting this reflection on this helmet of the text, and things like that just weren't possible in Element 3D version 1, but now you can do some pretty good stuff with reflection and shadows, and it's built to render efficiently with some good 3D tricks, which is important. So let's talk about these pipes. If we go back to this is kind of where we started to build them out, and I'll go to Scene Setup, and I'll just delete all these. So now I'll create a cylinder, press F to get my shaded view, press Z to center the camera, and I'll just quickly make a bunch of these by scaling the full thing down, making them longer. And what I want to do is have a collection of pipes that it looks like they're interacting with each other, kind of sticking out in different ways, as well as sitting in a ground. So what's nice is, again, I can grab all of these, hold Option, and just duplicate multiple objects if I need to, and just position them into place. So I don't have to even worry about separating them into groups. It's all in one group and one scene. So now we got some pipes, and I'll copy this last one because I want to be sitting above our ground just to illustrate the idea of shadows. And then I'm going to go to my Create tab, and I'm going to create a plane. And I'll just have this floor, and I'll make this a lot bigger, so it's much bigger than our scene. So I'll go like 5,000 by 5,000 by 5,000. So now I have this scene, and this is when we start to have issues in version 1, because once we start to light this, we would see shadows based on where the lights are, as well as the shadows from ones on top of the other. And if we quickly add some materials to these, let's go to Materials, and I'll go to Pro Shaders 2 to get some new ones. I'll add some reflective ones to these, as well as the ground. So just quickly go into Metal and just drag a couple of these to get different textures. And this is a nice little update where you can just drag them straight into the viewport. And I just want different reflective materials that realistically would be reflecting light in different ways, as well as the objects around it. And then I'll get a different one for the ground. Let's go to this rusted one. So now we have our scene. I'll go to OK, and I'll create a new camera so we can pan around and look around our scene. So here's our scene, and it looks like flat video game textures that don't really have lights. And what we're talking about with shadows and reflection is really rendering and how we're rendering it. So all this stuff is under render settings. You can see that this is much more detailed than it used to be. And before, what we could do, go to ambient occlusion, enable it, and in scene setup, we could change our environment to something different. So if we wanted a different HDRI material to show up in our reflections, we could turn on our environment, and then I'll double click on one of these, and that's going to make our reflections. And I'll make a new light, and we'll just have a parallel light kind of pointing at all of this. And if I move this up and point it at these objects, we could keep working it, but this was kind of where we could get to with version 1. And we could see that there's problems because we should see shadows based on where the light is on the ground, shadows interacting with the other objects, as well as the objects reflecting each other. So now there are settings for these that also build this in intelligent ways, so it's not going to blow up our render time by just adding completely real shadows and reflections. So the first thing we can do under ambient occlusion is change it from SSAO to ray trace, and that's going to be a higher render time, but make that look more realistic. Now if we go to shadows, we can enable shadows, and there's multiple options. And you might notice it looks like nothing happened. And it's important to note our shadows are turned on in Element 3D. It's still controlled by our light settings per light. So it's important in light settings to enable cast shadows. And that's going to turn on our After Effects shadow casting and impact objects in Element 3D. And you can get to all your light properties by going to light and pressing AA. It's really important to note that these are going to control what we're seeing in Element 3D, even though they're lights that are separate. So if we bring up our light intensity, you can see that there's very clearly shadows happening. And if we were to add other lights like a spotlight, which also works with these lights, I'll just position this one kind of in a similar place. And if I look at this from the top, I can make sure this light is pointing here. And it's important, again, to note that one, the lights that'll work is parallel and spotlights, and two, all these light properties are going to impact how the shadows appear in Element 3D. So if I change the cone angle and feathering of our light, it's going to change that. And if we turn up shadow diffusion on the lights, it's going to soften those shadows. So you can see with no diffusion, they're completely hard. Turning it up, we're gonna get softer, more realistic shadows. And you can see we're already starting to get there by turning on shadows. Now, in Element 3D, there's two modes to deal with this. There's shadow mapping and ray traced, which similar to the ambient occlusion, ray trace is going to take longer but give you a more realistic result. And in this case, shadow mapping looks fine. It's not bothering me, and it gets us there. So that helps we're getting shadows, and we can see the difference from turning these lights on and off. That's making a big difference. Now we want to talk about our reflections, because we're not seeing the objects reflecting in each other, and we're not seeing any reflection on our ground. So let's go to Element, and let's assume that ground is a really reflective material. So I'll get this clean metal, and in this we would really see those, but we don't. And that's a problem because that breaks the believability. So how we can turn that on for our ground is on our ground, we're gonna go down to reflection mode, and there's three options: environment, which is what we're seeing now with this HDRI map; mirror surface, which was what we'd want for a floor, which will work on a flat plane, which is important to note; and spherical, which we'll get to for the other options. So if we just have a flat plane and we want to mirror what's on top of it, we go to mirror surface, and we can see that those are showing up there, and we see the reflections of them, and that's a good start. Now, the other problem is these cylinders are really close to each other and different materials, so I should see the reflection of them and each other, but I don't. And let's change these a little too to make them really different. So I'll go back to my metal textures, and let's just make them very obviously different colors. Really drive my point home of what's happening here. So we got all these different cylinders. Now I should see the reflection of this one in this one, but we don't. So in standalone 3D apps, there's a couple ways we could do this. We could just turn on reflections for materials, and if we want to have blurry reflections, that's one thing that takes a long time to render. Or you could use an environment map like we're using here. And one trick you can do in 3D is build your own environment map based on the nearby objects and project that onto the scene. And that's what Element 3D does to address this. So how we do that is for each object that we want to do that with, we'd go to our object, click reflect, and then change them all to spherical. And that's going to turn on this setting where it's creating this spherical map from our current scene and projecting the reflections back onto it. So if I go to OK, if we just enable this on and off, you can see the difference. Here's no reflections with the spherical map, and here's enable spherical. So it's looking pretty realistic, and it makes it more realistic, but it's also cutting down on render time because it's still not really calculating those reflections. And this is a good solution in 3D when you want to create the idea of reflections, but not blow up the render time. And they're not pulling this stuff out of their ass with the concepts. This is something we could do in 3D. So say in a Cinema 4D, for example, if we have all these reflective spheres, we're going to see all of the other spheres around it in their reflections. And you can see that it takes time to render that sort of thing. And if these were blurry, not completely crisp reflections, that can take a long time to render. So imagine if rather than this, we were using a sphere in the middle of all of this that's catching our reflections and projecting it back on. Well, that's exactly what Element 3D is doing, is taking a sphere of our environment, making it completely reflective, capturing this image as a flat image, which you could also do in 3D programs by baking a texture of only reflections and using this image, and then instead of using actual reflection, using an environment map with that image, which will speed up render time a lot and is a good technique in 3D. And that's basically what Element 3D is doing to save on render time and get the idea of reflections without really exploding your render time. All right, let's move on. Number 3, SubObject Animation. So again, one thing that version 1 was really good at is if we just have basic objects, let's say this sports drink, and you just want to have the camera move around or to have a bunch of them replicating, it worked great like that. But if we want to do really specific things, like say, I want just the cap to fly on and off and animate in a very specific way, that got to be kind of tricky and cumbersome. We'd have to hide this cap, duplicate the whole group, change this group to 2, hide everything but the cap, and then this would be our cap group, and then animate on the group just the cap. And you can see that it seems a little needlessly tricky if you're trying to do just a couple specific position, scale, rotation things, and you could very quickly use up your groups. Well, version 2 fixes this. And just to drive this point home further, here's a real project I did where this came up, where there's this chair that I made and it's moving around, and there's these couple specific animations of the drawers pop open, then the other drawer pops open, and then we keep flying around the chair. And this was a good project to do in Element 3D because it doesn't need to look hyper realistic. I can have all the chairs snap into one, and it's a pretty long animation. The full thing was about a minute long, and I needed to do a bunch of different versions of it, so I really needed the good render time. But this one specific thing was a little tricky. So how this project went down is I built this chair in Maya, filled it up with everything, and really just needed to animate the drawers and all the contents in and out. And again, I had to do that method of putting it on different groups, duplicating the groups just to do that. So now what we can do is use auxiliary channels to do this. So if I grab this chair, there's my chair I made, and it looks like these ridiculous colors because previously this is how you would do the texturing if you built a 3D model and you wanted it to show up as different textures. So now rather than duplicating the whole group, I could just look at my textures within my one group, have copies that are just the chair and each drawer with everything turned on and off for each. So I could have this just be chair, go turn off all the drawers and all the contents of the drawers. And similarly, just duplicate the model, have this be drawer L, and then turn off everything except those, which is what I have here of one group, my chair, of just the chair, and then my left drawer and right drawer. And this is all within the same group. Now, how we could animate these separately without breaking up into groups and getting kind of messy. On our object, there's now this auxiliary animation. So we could put different objects in the same group on different aux channels. So I have my chair on 1, my drawer left on 2, my drawer right on 3. And if I go to OK, here's my chair. And rather than digging into all different groups, I can go to aux channels right here and just grab channel 2 and 3, and I could slide and animate those drawers out as I need to, and then have them snap back in while still having the whole group under particle replicator control the whole chair. So it's a little thing, but if you're doing really specific animation and you don't want to clutter up all the groups, it's a really good addition to make having more control over little minor animations within a group a lot easier. All right, let's get out of there. Let's take a look at these pipes again. So number 4 is Backlight, and this is a big one. This is really gives you a lot more control over what your scene looks like. So previously in version 1, there was environment, and if you click on environment, you can see that it already looks updated, and there was about 10 or so different ones. So basically everything they ever made ended up looking like the reflections were in a studio or on a rooftop. Now if we look under environment, there's our original one. So again, everything looks like it's on a studio, a rooftop, or a parking garage. Now in addition to those basic HDRI maps, which will take care of our lighting and reflections in our scene, we can go to backlight environments, and there's 2K and 4K sizes. And now there's all of these that really allow you to have more control over different ways of lighting your scene with HDRI reflection maps. And you can see how many of those there are here. And this really pushes what you can do. And if we go to environment, this UI is updated, as I mentioned, and you can really get a bigger idea of what's going on here and really adjust your reflections further. And this is, of course, a great example because this one looks ridiculous, but really tone in how you want those extra reflections and light maps to affect your scene. And the other part of Backlight is over here in our model browser. If we go to this Backlight tab, there's all of these extra standalone parts and lights that simulate real lights and light rings and arrays that we could bring into our scene, move around, scale and rotate to kind of mimic the idea of our lights being in a studio. And I'll just put this above the camera. And you can see that it's working within our reflection and affecting that. So if I go to OK again, you can see that pretty dramatically changed the look of our scene, and we still get some pretty speedy rendering and movement. Number 5, deformers. So one thing that's really useful on logos is being able to deform and change the geometry, as well as on all sorts of animation. So if we have some text here and we wanted to extrude it, we could go to custom layers and grab that text that says logo here in After Effects and just hide that and go to scene setup and do extrude. And there we got our logo, and let's just add a shader to that. So we get something to look at and then throw an environment on it just to make it look interesting right away. And there's our logo. And we can just drop a camera in and pan around that. And that's great, it's extruded, but what if we want this to kind of be bent? And if we think about sports logos, for example, you're always seeing these bent shields, and you couldn't do anything about that in version 1. But again, in version 2, we can do all sorts of new stuff. So now if I go to that group that it's in and go to particle look, I have this new deform tab, which I can enable. And then I can do things like enable bending the geometry, and we can bend our logo on X or Z and do some pretty weird stuff, as well as center it if it looks like the bend angle is getting off, and add up different deformers like twist and make that all weird. And all these properties are animatable, so this is what's really good. And it might look kind of silly now, but what this is doing is taking our geometry from our scene and bending that. So it's important that you have geometry. For example, if you just had a cube, you can see that there's not enough geometry, and you would need to go into your model and change the subdivision level. Just to make a point of that, let's turn off this extrusion model. We got our cube. It looks weird. Go to scene setup, subdivision level, turn that up. You can see there's more geometry, and doesn't look that different because I didn't have much on it, but you can see it now. It's gonna bend correctly. So it's a useful thing to do, especially for logos and motion graphics. And bending and deforming things, again, is important in 3D animation. If we had the same sort of thing in Cinema 4D, for example, this is something we'd be looking for, where we have deformers to drop into shapes and be able to bend and twist them around. So getting deformers in Element 3D to deform our geometry is a really important step, and a really nice touch to add some more control over what you're doing with your animations. And speaking of Cinema 4D, I know I'm already at number 5, but one of the things I'm also really excited about is not just importing 3D models, but you can also grab Cinema 4D models and materials and import them directly, and it allows you to import the materials, animations, and lots of stuff straight into Element 3D. So here's this glass model I made with the word logo sitting in it now. And you can bring Cinema 4D models straight into Element 3D, as well as a lot of other things between the two programs. So if you're wondering why I'm at 5 and I didn't get into that, well, no one watches top 6 videos, but also it's such a huge topic that I want to get into that in a completely separate video of everything you can do between Element 3D and Cinema 4D, because it's a big thing. They kind of snuck that in on us, but it's one thing that I'm really excited about, and you can do a lot with it. So definitely look for that video next, and hit me up with any questions on that, because it's going to be a big topic of everything you can send to Element 3D from Cinema 4D, as well as take stuff from Element 3D like our backlight and our materials and shaders and bring them into Cinema 4D if you're more of a Cinema 4D artist and just want to use all this cool stuff. So those are some of my top features. There's a lot of other new stuff in Element 3D. Besides these top things, there's so much more. There's new physical shaders which mimic real physical properties, which are going to give you a lot more believable materials. Maybe we want to throw this into a grid array, and then we have some logo cups or whatever. There's a lot more updates to our render settings. There's subsurface scattering now, which, if you're wondering what that is, it's a thing you can bring up at parties to try and show off to your friends about how much you understand how light works, which always goes over really well. Assets to use from the new motion design to packs, which is tons of cool stuff. So definitely a lot more than just these couple things, but way too much to include in one video. So I'll have a lot more videos on different topics with Element 3D version 2, such as the Cinema 4D topic, more stuff about how to get more advanced with extruding and bending and distorting logos, as well as a lot of new topics about the new version of the plugin because it's such a huge thing. So look out for those videos as well. And if you have any questions or requests for tutorial videos, definitely let me know in the comments or send me an email, as well as hit me up on twitter.com/SeanFrangella and facebook.com/Vitel if you want to follow me on the social networks or request tutorials and ask questions that way. And as always, thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot about Element 3D version 2. It's a really exciting update to the plugin. It's something I'm really excited to integrate into my workflow, as well as work between Element 3D and Cinema 4D to really have all of the options of how to best approach projects. So as always, thanks for watching. This has been Sean Frangella for sjanimate.com, and I will see you at the next video.